From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, the federal budget. What are the nation's priorities?
One of the most important functions of government is budgeting. The federal budget is a collection of estimates of how much money will be coming in, how much will be going out, and for what will it be spent. Over the last 10 years, federal spending has increased about 11% a year. President Ford's proposed new budget would cut that rate of spending growth in half for the fiscal year that begins in October 1976. Is this the policy the economy needs or that the country wants? Is now the time to reduce government spending while the economy is recovering from the worst recession since the 30s? Does the new budget provide enough stimulus to the economy to reduce unemployment, but not enough to overstimulate the economy, which might send inflation soaring once again? Welcome to another in a series of Rational Debate seminars presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Our subject is the federal budget. What are the nation's priorities? Our debaters are experts in the field of government budgeting. James Lynn, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, a member of the President's Cabinet. Mr. Lynn is an attorney whose undergraduate degree was in economics and political science. Before becoming budget chief, Mr. Lynn served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Charles L. Schultze, a former federal budget director during the Johnson years, now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Schultze holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Maryland, where he now teaches economics. He is the author of many books and articles on economics, budgeting, and national priorities. Conducting our debate will be Eileen Shanahan, an economics writer for the New York Times. Now, our moderator, Eileen Shanahan.
Thank you, Peter Hackus, and good evening. We're here for another Rational Debate sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On my right is the present director of the President's Office of Management and Budget, James T. Lynn. And on my left, which may be only appropriate, one of the last, I guess the next to last of the Democratic directors of the same organization, which then had a slightly different name, of the Bureau of the Budget, Charles L. Schultze, an economist now with the Brookings Institution. We will open with Mr. Lynn making his affirmative case for the choices that are already embodied in President Ford's budget.
Thank you. 180 years ago, we reached our first $100 billion budget of the United States. 20 years later, we are arguing about whether it should be somewhat a little lower than $400 billion or substantially above $400 billion. Equally dramatic has been the change in the makeup of that budget. Contrary, I think, to a lot of understanding on the part of the public, the defense budget, although it was more than half of the budget 20 years ago, is now roughly 26% of the budget of the United States. Human resources, on the other hand, are up 500% in the last 10 years. And as you can see with this chart up here, we have moved from a place where human resources were about 19% of the budget some 20 years ago to where now they are pushing upwards of 50%, and when you include grants to state and local governments, are up to about 55% of the budget. Now, this has a very good side to it. The good side is that it shows a nation that cares. And as we've had more resources that we have been able to spend, we've chosen to spend them where we can meet those unmet needs, whether for people, elderly, the poor, the sick, for communities, particularly older communities that need help. As I say, it shows a nation that cares. Unfortunately, although there can be growth in these programs for human resources and for state and local government, it can't continue at the pace of the last 10 years or 20 years. In 1946, Total expenditures by governments, federal, state, and local, were about 17% of total expenditures in the United States. In 1955, they were still under 25%. This year, we don't know for sure because state and local figures come in kind of late, but my guess would be they'll be somewhere in a range between 35 to 38%. In other words, the 35 to 38 cents out of every dollar spent in the economy will have been spent by one government or another. Let's bring that a little closer to home, if we might. What that means is that an average family of 4 earning $14,000 a year works until approximately, I'm told by my head economist, April 15th to pay all of their taxes, federal, state, and local. Putting that still another way, to bring it into a tighter time frame, it means that the average American family making $14,000 a year works all day Monday and the better part of Tuesday before that family starts working for itself, for its decisions, its choices as to how it spends its money. The President believes that we are reaching a point where too many of the choices are being made by government, number one, rather than the people that earn the money and the people that want to invest the money. And secondly, that we've come to the point where we have to reduce the massive deficits that this country has been running. What does he propose doing about it? The budget this year for the forthcoming year that begins October 1st would run somewhere around $419 to $425 billion. I don't think there's any disagreement on that. If we were to have a business as usual kind of budget, what I call a salami-like budget where you keep the programs you have and where you add $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and after a while it adds up to real money, as one wag once said. We don't believe this country can stand to have budgets that are growing at roughly $50 billion a year, and that's what they're running about now. The President says, let's cut back that rate of growth, which has been around 10, 11% a year in the federal budget, to somewhere around 5.5%. And that means holding expenditures to the range of $394, $395 billion. He also says that as a matter of economic policy, let's start on our way toward a balanced budget 2 years after the fiscal year that's starting up now. As most people know, we've had very high deficits this last year, brought about in the main from the recession and brought about from efforts to cope with that recession by way of increased unemployment benefits, help to people that are poor, made poor, been hurt by the recession itself. But we believe that we can get the deficit down safely this year to $43 billion. Now, that's by cutting expenses to $395 billion. At the same time, however, that $43 billion deficit on the way to a balanced budget 2 years from now would allow a further tax cut from the tax cut that was given this last year by laws passed by Congress and signed by the President. The further income tax cut that this would accommodate would give the average family of 4 making $14,000 again an income tax cut of something like $227 more of take-home pay that family would have that they wouldn't have under the current law. Now, at the same time, the President is saying our Social Security system is in some trouble, not immediate trouble, but we do have to take some action so that in the years ahead we don't find that fund depleted of assets. So he is asking that Congress pass a law increasing somewhat, 0.3 of 1 point, to be paid by the employer and another 0.3 of 1% to be paid by the employee to help make the Social Security fund whole. That would reduce that further tax cut that the President talked about from $227 down to around $179 or $180. But it would still be a net gain in the take-home pay of the American taxpayer at that average level of about $180. What are our chances? I should add one other thing at this point. The President at the same time is trying to reform a number of programs of the federal government. Some of these reforms are necessary to arrive at the $395 billion. In fact, some $11 billion of the saving implicit in that number is dependent upon Congress passing revisions in existing laws. The rest of it, of course, is dependent on Congress going along with the President on appropriation acts. The President has said a number of times, let's get rid of programs that don't work very well to make room for programs that do. A good example are the programs that the President wants to put into block grants That means taking many, many individual categorical programs and taking that money and putting it together in pools of money that is spread around the country to states and to communities on the basis of relative need, so that the exact way that money is used to take care of an objective that would be provided in the law is determined locally. A good example is health services. I have a large chart with me today that shows where we are on health service programs. This is the chart over here on the far side. Those are the health service programs of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, incidentally, there are more health service programs in the Veterans Administration, the Defense Department, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so on. In fact, I even had a couple of them in HUD, tangentially. What the President is saying, let's take out of all of these programs, 16 of them, including Medicaid, and put them together in a block grant program with no lessened amount of funds, but with no growth to speak of either in the funds except for Medicaid, where there would be $800 million worth of growth in the forthcoming year. And let's take that money, send it out to the states, and let the states decide how the needs of the lower income families are going to be met and the institution and environmental health needs of the communities. What are our chances? I have to say to you, I don't know. We've lived in a past political world where the motto seems to have been spend, 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 tax, 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 re-elect, re-elect, re-elect. In fact, there have been times when I wondered whether the tax part of that's in there or whether the motto was simply spend, 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 re-elect, re-elect, re-elect. Now, you can't blame Congress totally for this. The American people themselves, including people that run HUD, or at least former people that ran HUD, have split personalities in this regard. We're all for restraint. We all want to hold down the deficit. We all want to get rid of inflation. We all want to get governments off our back. But at the same time, out of this catalog of domestic assistance programs, where there were 1,006 of them at the beginning of the year, and there are now 1,030 of them, this book is obsolete. Amongst those programs is something for every business and every person in America and almost every institution. And what most people have said over the years is, we're right with you, Mr. President, we're right with you, Jim Lynn, and everybody's program except mine. I do detect, though, among the American people today, and the President detects the same, that the American people are waking up to the fact there isn't a free lunch. There is no way this country can go on year after year with massive deficits. We do have to get ourselves back to balanced budget. It is inextricably linked to inflation, and that if we do have inflation of the kind we've had in the past, what we're going to see is a country where a system of competition, risk, and reward of investment cannot flourish, let alone survive. Therefore, we think it is an important year, a crossroads year. It is largely up to the Congress and in turn to the people of the United States. If Congress gets the message from the people of the United States that they want restraint, that they want programmatic reform, this country will get it. If they don't get that message, we won't have those reforms, and we won't have that movement toward a balanced budget 2 years out, better programs, and get rid of some of these that don't work. Thank you.
You have a little time left over. We'll let you reserve it. And now I would like to turn to Dr. Charles Schultze of the Brookings Institution.
Thank you. Jim Lynn and I have 20 minutes. Talk about a $400 billion budget. That's $20 billion a minute. To put it in a more economic term, in terms of the difference between us, it's going to turn out, as you'll see in a moment, we're about $20 billion apart in terms of the federal budget, and that works out to a nice, neat $1 billion a minute in terms of the difference between us. And let's see if I can cover the $1 billion a minute in my 20 minutes. I want to talk about two things. One, federal budget policy as it relates to overall economic performance, to unemployment and inflation, and look at the president's budget and some alternatives in that regard. Secondly, to take some look at some particular aspects of budgetary priorities as proposed in the president's budget, and also look at some alternatives. Let me start with the budget and the economy. At the present time, our economy is recovering at a moderately good clip from what Eileen Shanahan pointed out was the worst recession in 40 years. Not only that, the likelihood is that it's going to continue recovering at a pretty good clip for the next 6 to 9 months, or maybe even in a year, regardless of what we do about the 1977 budget. That's a budget that starts next October, and performance this year is based on this year's budget And what we're really talking about in terms of the budget and the economy is what is 1977 going to be like in terms of continuing recovery. Output is now rising at 6 to 7% a year. Price inflation, while still far too high, is running in some underlying sense at about 5.5%, maybe 6.5% a year, well below the double-digit figures of some time ago. So things are looking not great, but pretty good. But let's look back a year ago. At that time, the president proposed a budget with a $52 billion budget deficit, $350 billion of expenditures, and about $298 billion of revenues. That deficit was less than the drop in revenues caused by the recession. On a high employment or full employment basis, that budget would have been in surplus by $12 billion. We were warned when the president proposed that budget with a $52 billion deficit that going beyond that significantly would generate a deficit that would raise interest rates, crowd out private investment, retard recovery, and possibly reignite inflation. Indeed, at least one member of the president's cabinet at the time appeared to have some questions as to whether or not even the $52 billion deficit wasn't going too far. Now, what happened? In fact, the Congress ignored that budget. The Congress increased expenditures over and above the president's recommendation. It added to the size of the president's recommended tax cut. Under the new budget procedures, which the Congress has just adopted, for the first time in history, the Congress went on record explicitly voting for a larger budget deficit than the president recommended, and ended up voting for a budget deficit almost $25 billion larger than the president recommended. And what happened? We got a pretty good recovery going. Inflation didn't reignite. Despite a really poor rate of growth in the money supply, interest rates haven't risen, private investment hasn't been crowded out, and the president is in very good shape for his reelection possibilities. I'm suggesting that what's going to happen this year is pretty much a repeat of last year, that the president has come in with a very restrictive budget, and the Congress is more or less going to ignore it and go on their own merry way with a responsible budget but somewhat higher deficit. And the recovery will probably continue through 1977 without reigniting inflation. Let me be a little more specific. As Jim Lynn said, a hands-off budget, no new policy changes, continue existing laws in effect, give agencies enough additional money simply to account for rising prices, but no more, kind of a hands-off, no policy change budget. We would have budget expenditures of about $415 billion when I do some accounting adjustments to get it in line with what the president's proposed. And the president's budget of expenditures is $395 billion, $20 billion lower. That hands-off, no policy change budget would drop the budget deficit next year from $75 billion, where it now is, to about $50 to $55 billion, about a $20 billion drop in the budget. It would be mildly restrictive. It would begin to move us towards a balanced budget, but do so, quite frankly, rather cautiously, because we are just in the beginning stages of a recovery from a deep recession. Compared to that budget, a hands-off, no policy change budget, what would the president's budget do? First, it would reduce spending below that by $20 billion. Secondly, as Jim Lynn pointed out, kind of net, it would cut $5 billion in taxes. So it would reduce spending by 20, reduce taxes by 5. It would, in effect, be restrictive. It would pull funds out of the economy to the tune of about $15 billion additional. It would kind of switch towards restriction to the tune of $15 billion. The real outlays of the federal government, the real inflation-adjusted constant purchasing power outlays of the federal government would drop by 3%. Outside of defense and interest, all other outlays in real inflation-adjusted terms would drop by 5 to 6%. It would, in other words, be a significantly restrictive budget, pulling back on the federal government's stimulus to the economy as we are about 1/4 of the way out of the recession. There would be no impact of this set of actions, as I said before, in 1976. The economy would keep on moving along. The real question is, Can economic recovery continue at reasonable rates in 1977 with that kind of a budget? It obviously implies, the President's budget obviously implies, that he believes that there could be a very strong recovery in the private economy to keep recovery going, when at the same time the federal government is pulling in its horns very substantially during that period. Let me remind you that to reduce unemployment, which currently stands a shade below 8%, to reduce unemployment by 1% a year, it takes a 7% a year growth in our national economy. So if we simply want to have the relatively modest objective over the next several years of reducing unemployment by 1 percentage point a year from 8 to 7 to 6, the economy ought to grow at 7% a year. Let me go through a little arithmetic exercise with you, given that objective of trying to grow somewhere between 6 and 7% a year. First, let's take the President's budget and measure it adjusted for inflation. Let's see how much the federal government will be purchasing from this economy. Let's see how much the federal government will, through its Social Security and other programs, be financing by way of private consumption. Let's add to that the purchases of state and local governments, so that we then have, in one lump sum, over the next year, and given the President's budget, how much the governmental sector of the economy would be contributing to our national recovery. Then let's do something else. Let's simply calculate how much our total gross national product would have to grow to reach the President's own announced targets of a 6% growth in the economy. So I'm taking a 6% growth in the economy, I'm taking the President's budget and calculating how much it's going to contribute, putting together that with state and local government so I get the total governmental contribution. I subtract the second from the first, and I have how much the private economy has to grow to keep decent recovery going with the President's budget. And finally, I compare that required growth with every one of our prior post-war recoveries. It turns out that with the President's budget, to reach the President's own modest targets for growth, the private economy would have to grow in 1977 at 9%. What has been the average rate of growth in the private economy in post-war recoveries in the second year? 5%. There is no single second year of recovery in which the private economy grew by anywhere near as much as it would be required to grow to keep recovery going with the President's budget. There's only one year that comes close, the year of the big explosion in private demand when the Chinese marched into North Korea, in which case we did indeed get a single big explosion, and even that won't quite do the trick. Or to say this another way, if the private economy grows at the same rate that on the average it's grown in other post-war recoveries, with the President's restrictive budget, we would have, after the end of this year, a rate of growth in the economy which would roughly keep the unemployment rate unchanged at something in the neighborhood of 7%. Now, Eileen, Shanahan, if I have time, I'll turn to priorities, but I suspect I may have used up my time.
No, you still have some time.
Good. Let me make a couple of points on that. I have some things to say about defense, but I think I'll let them go, perhaps for the question and answer session, and turn to the domestic budget, where I think there's some good news and some bad news in the administration's budget. First, I fully agree with the administration's move to consolidate, reform, and streamline a number of grant and aid programs to state and local governments, pulling back on the excessive federal control, blocking them together, making them more rational. But at the same time, you shouldn't confuse reform and reduction. The administration proposes to streamline, modify, block together these grants, and at the same time cut them. And logically, they're two separate things. And given the state of state and local finances at the present time, it seems to me, in terms of where we are in the economy and where state and local governments are, one can move to simplify that chart, block grants together without cutting. In the case of education and health grants to state and local governments, there is indeed a melange of individual, chaotic, Topsy-like grants which need to be pulled together and consolidated. but not cut by $3 billion as the administration proposes. I see no rationale for that.
You get a chance for rebuttal, Jim Lynn.
Thank you. One of the things that always interests me when I hear this debate on how much deficit in fiscal year 77 is a good amount of deficit, the reaction usually is, A, there should be a bigger deficit, and B, the way you should have it is by accommodating bigger expenditures. It seems to me, and I know that Dr. Schultze would agree with this, these are two separate issues, very much so. What should be the level of stimulus by way of deficit for the year and how you get there? I hear from a lot of my friends on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, that, oh, we really do need a much bigger deficit. But it's always funny how that accommodates a business-as-usual growth in those 1,030 programs. That as long as we can rationalize or justify a big deficit, having made that decision, now we can say to all you folks, let me tell you, that gives us a chance with all of these programs to add more money to them, and doesn't that make me a hero with every interest group in America? But I do want to make the point, I think that there is a difference between the amount of the deficit, and I know Charlie agrees with this, and how you arrive at it. The second thing is, I am a little interested on how we came in at $52 billion for fiscal year 76, and now, alas, we're at 76. Let me say, Dr. Schultze, we don't want to take any credit for that $76 billion. It's all yours. In fact, as it goes a little higher, I hope that my friends on the other side of the aisle will take full credit for it. We did not feel, still don't to this day, the President doesn't, I most surely do not, that we needed anywhere near $76 billion worth of deficit. My calculations would indicate that some 10 at least, $11 billion of that overage over where the President wanted when we got to the $60 billion is due to congressional actions of various kinds, either rejecting the President's proposals for rescissions or deferrals or for legislative change and so on. We really do believe we'd be having a good recovery right now if it hadn't been that high. Now, that's a tough position for either of us to take because I can't prove it one way and you can't prove it the other. But I'm firmly convinced of it, that we could have done just as well with a lower deficit than we had before. Last thing I'd like to say, if I'm running out of time here, in this regard is we hear a whole lot about the government must keep up. The government must spend as it did before or everything's going to go to the devil. Called fiscal drag, I think is the word for it. I have said before, I'll say it again, I think fiscal drag as a theory is like the varsity drag. Each one of them had their day and that day is past. I really do believe that we have come to a time when if we give a signal to the private sector that we do mean business on getting deficits down, that we do mean that Bill Simon isn't going to be in there competing for the money, that we are going to see growth, very strong growth, in the private sector. Now, you said you'd be all for that, Charlie, if we reversed it and we were for adding expenditures when things were booming. I'm saying, no, that isn't the case. I think we all acknowledge that there's a band of stimulus. Above that, you can get into the troubles that other countries have had. None of us know where that edge is when stimulus becomes too much stimulus. All we know about on our side of the fence is that it's a little like walking along a cliff in the dark, that you don't know where the edge of that cliff is, but if you reach it and go over it, there's no way of coming back.
And on that
but if we're wrong, if we are wrong, we can always add stimulus. It's hard to take it away at a given point.
Charlie Schultze?
Yeah, my only problem with that, I guess, I have several problems, not my only problem. You can fall off the cliff two ways. And one way is to fall off the cliff into a resumption of a recession and an increase in unemployment. I quite agree. It's a very difficult line to walk, but, a little bit more fear about falling off the cliff on the one side might balance the fear of falling off the cliff on the other side. Second proposition. It's interesting that a lower deficit doesn't stimulate the economy, a higher deficit doesn't stimulate the economy, presumably, but somehow it's going to cause inflation if we go too high. I don't quite understand that. It may be kind of a threshold theory that an extra $10 billion or $15 billion worth of deficit that the Congress put in didn't help stimulate demand in the economy, but a larger deficit would somehow overstimulate the economy. I haven't been able quite to follow that line of reasoning. Let me also turn to the very legitimate point that Jim Lynn raises. If you want a given economic stimulus, why does it always have to be through expenditures? Why not through lower expenditures and a larger tax cut? You know, that surely wouldn't bother me. However, I do think you have to make judgments about what you buy with a tax cut and what you buy with an expenditure reduction. If I look at large numbers of the areas where the administration is planning to reduce expenditures, I find that something like 7 to 8 billion of them are in grants, financial support to state and local governments. In my judgment, reducing that 7 to 8 billion dollars in expenditures and then reducing taxes isn't going to save the taxpayer one thin nickel. It's going to mean what you are going to get is larger financial requirements on the part of state and local governments, higher taxes on the part of state and local governments, most of which are much more inequitable and less economically efficient than the federal government's tax system. So it really isn't that neat a choice between expenditure reductions and tax cuts. Finally, let me say, quite frankly, I'm not ashamed of wanting a larger deficit. In the right period of time, under the right economic circumstances, a larger deficit can be good. Too much of any good thing, including candy, isn't good for you. But there is nothing that scares me, that should scare anybody about a rational argument about what is the appropriate size of the deficit to help this economy continue on a certain pattern. Rational men, hopefully we're both rational, can argue about it, but it's not a scare word, and the fact that it ends up in a deficit should be a neutral fact.
Thank you both. In a few minutes, we'll come back for questions from our audience, many of whom are specially invited experts to hear this debate.
The federal budget process is complicated, seen differently through different eyes. Some opponents of President Ford's new budget proposal, for example, say that his $394 billion spending program is as much as $20 to $25 billion too low, that more spending is needed to guarantee enough stimulus to cure the recession. But such a spending increase would also increase the red ink federal deficit by that amount, which other experts say would be bad for the country. To challenge both our speakers, let's hear now from our panel of experts in the audience and their questions.
We'll now move to the questions, and I assert the moderator's privilege of asking the first one. Charlie Schultze, you have said that you approve of the President's plan to consolidate some of this mishmash of what we call categorical programs, to unify them and put them together, but that the waters shouldn't be muddied by, at the same time, cutting the amount of available funds, as the budget does for such things as health and education. My question is this: if this isn't the right year to cut, is there a right year to cut?
Cutting, once you block them together, cutting federal outlays or financial support for state and local education and health, I don't particularly see why any year is a reason to cut. I do not see why it is not good national policy to have some significant, not necessarily rapidly growing, fraction of state and local support for education, somewhat redistributed, because that's what the grants would do, and modestly supported by the federal government. So in those particular programs, I guess my answer is, in the foreseeable future as I see it, I see no reason why any year is a good year to cut.
Mr. Lynn, I wanted to follow up on something that Dr. Schultze said earlier in the program, and my question to you, which is this. He said the economy is doing as well as it is right now, and everyone agrees it's doing rather well. Unemployment is coming down nicely, inflation is getting less. And he says the only reason that happened is because the Democratic Congress violated the president's budget for last year, cut taxes more, created some additional spending, and enlarged the deficit. And that's the only reason the economy is in as good shape as it's in. What do you say to that?
I'd say that isn't the reason at all. But as I've said before, this will be an endless debate, I suppose, particularly in an election year. I do recall back in March, I think it was, of last year, February and March, when things were really gloomy indeed. This does not include Dr. Schultze, but there were a number of economists who thought that our stimulus wouldn't even be enough in the 70s of billions of dollars. And we had some people that were even saying $90, $100 billion would be a good starter. Now, that was not Dr. Schultze. Let me make that very, very clear. But in fact, there were calls of gloom and doom that unless we had deficits of $90, $100 billion, that recession was going to spiral into a never-ending depression. I have to say that I really do believe that we could have gotten along just as well in the 50s, the $60 billion range. I do think the deficit went higher than the $50 billion because of estimating differences, first of all. It had nothing to do, taking the same format that we had put into the budget, that when you saw the severity of the recession as it developed, there were add-on numbers just due to re-estimating. There were more people unemployed than we had predicted would be, and that added up to numbers. There was less receipts than there might have been otherwise. So our deficits increased in part, and that's why the president dramatically drew that line with the squeaky chalk, I remember it pretty well, at $60 billion, because we knew there were re-estimates after the budget had been put to bed. And one of the things that's very difficult as a budgeteer, and I know that Charlie will agree with this, is having people understand that budget making in large measure is estimating. And some of those estimates are pretty good, and others of them are very difficult to do. If you want the toughest one of all, try Outer Continental Shelf receipts sometime. But there are other ones that are difficult.
You only missed that by $4 billion last year.
That's right. And as I've said this year, here's our calculations, here's how we did it, and if somebody's got a better way, please be our guest. But the point I'm trying to make is, I think that we saw this economy come back because there was a pattern of the inventories working their way down. There was some effort toward restraint. If I do recall, the loyal opposition in a reply speech took credit for having cut out some $15, $20 billion, they said, out of requests that otherwise would have been made. The juxtaposition of that statement in relation to another sounded like it was president's proposals, but that isn't what he meant. He meant proposals that were coming from the Congress. So there was some restraint from where it would have been. But I really do believe that we would have had essentially the same recovery at a lower amount of money. What happened is you had consumer confidence coming back. It came back pretty strongly. They started buying pretty well. The tax reduction, I think, did help. I don't think it had to be as deep as it was, but it helped in the recovery fairly substantially. I do think that what we saw was the bleed off of the inventories, continued buying by the consumer. I think they did see some effort by Congress, not anywhere near what we would like to have seen, that they were trying to show some responsibility through the budget process that you talked about, Charlie, that they did make some effort to hold it down. Not enough, but some. And I think all of those things gave the people kind of a feeling that maybe it won't be business as usual. Maybe these people really are trying to get a handle on it. What does worry me on some of the $76 billion is what it means as to future out year expenses.
That means any year after this one.
Any year after this one. I look at the kinds of proposals that the president has been holding off satisfactorily so far. That so-called jobs bill, $6.5 billion. Well, the main effect wouldn't be in fiscal year 76. It would be in 77, $2.5 billion. And there'd be another roughly $2 billion worth in 78 and 79. Now, if Congress comes along now and starts adding budget authority in these programs of various kinds, it would be well and good if you could fine-tune it and just say that we're going to add another $3 billion for 77. But that isn't the way it works. You add to a highway program, salami it, add a little bit more money, or other public works, or an environmental unit, and you feel it in 78, 79. How are you going to turn it off then?
Let's get a fresh question input over here.
My name's Mel Barney, and I'd like to ask Dr. Schultze, what specifically would you spend the extra $20 billion on?
Let's see. Well, I think one way to look at that is to take a look at what the administration is cutting out in its $20 billion. Because parts of that, not all of it, I think ought to be restored, at least during the next year. In the first place, I would not reduce public service employment as rapidly as the administration proposes. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't happen to think public service employment is the world's great answer to our problems. And I don't think that's the way to get back to full employment without inflation, as apparently some bills on the Hill now seem to think. But Nevertheless, in the coming year, the $1.8 billion that public service employment is reduced, I think, should not be reduced. I've also indicated I do not think this is the year to pull out about $7 billion of grants and aid in real terms. Even though I would consolidate, I would not reduce the grant in aid, excluding public service employment, by that $7 billion. I do not think that that I would handle the Medicare problem differently. The administration, again, has, I think, basically a sound approach to Medicare. Give the old people larger coverage for catastrophic expenditures, make them pay more for small medical expenditures. That's a good idea. It helps control costs. But they're doing it in a way which net requires the elderly to pay out $2 billion more in medical expenditures than they're now paying out. I would have the same program, but increase cash benefits by $2 billion to make up for that. So as you go through all of these things, I begin to get up to my $415 billion. In other words, I would tend to restructure the budget the way the administration wants to in many areas, but keep the level of funding, particularly for state and local governments, up. And that would, in effect, add, not all, but most of that money I'm talking about.
I think we have a gentleman in the center here.
My name is Bo Voort with the Machinery and Allied Products Institute. I'd just like to raise a question about this unemployment rate, which of course is a central concern. Isn't a lot of this unemployment structural in nature, a good deal more of it than was the case 10 or 15 years ago? And don't we have to take account of the fact that this means that we'll have to settle for a somewhat higher unemployment rate given the same level of general economic activity than we had 10 or 15 years ago? What unemployment rate is feasible under today's circumstances, and how can we avoid getting back into a double-digit inflation problem by reducing it beyond that level?
I think maybe both of our panelists would like to answer that, but we'll start with Jim Lynn.
Well, it is true that you can't look at unemployment as a monolithic problem, that every person's problem is the same as every other one. But even given the fact that there is a chronic unemployment group, the inner city, the minority in the inner city particularly is a classic case of a real problem that we have yet to get a handle on. Here and there some encouragement, but still one that we really haven't come to grips on. There's the new entrant in the labor force, which is another group of people. The new entrant in the labor force that's older, not just high school level, but a married second wage earner in the family. But even having said all of that, our unemployment rate today reflects still the vestiges of the recession. But you are right, we have to take a look at each one of those problems and address those problems separately. I think we sometimes get carried away with a precise number. I'm encouraged, I've heard it twice tonight, hear others acknowledge it, that we have made some real progress in getting the unemployment rate down in the last 4 to 5 months. When you go from, 8.9 to 7.6 in 4 or 5 months, or well, not all of that in 4 or 5 months, but over the last year, that's not bad. But we still have a long way to go. I'd prefer to put it that what we want to get to is a situation where everybody who wants a job can find one. Now, whether that results with an unemployment rate of X or Y isn't nearly as important as that overall objective.
Charlie?
Well, let's see. The central problem in pushing the unemployment rate down is that as it goes lower and lower and lower and the labor market gets tighter and tighter and tighter, you tend to begin to threaten ticking off and reigniting inflation. I happen to be very pessimistic about that, as a matter of fact. I think that the level at which the inflation would get ticked off again, I don't mean it's a nice sharp corner, but the level at which inflation would get ticked off again is a higher level of unemployment than it used to be. I think maybe we're dealing, for a lot of reasons, with having to worry when we get the unemployment rate down between 5 and 5.5% instead of when we get it down to 4%, for a lot of structural reasons. Having said that, I think, and I probably am going to overstate this, but that's all right, that the central problem of the Western industrial world is how to get that unemployment rate significantly lower without reigniting inflation. I think the very largest group of social problems in this country, there is no single thing that will do more for it than a tight labor market. You can have all the government programs till they're coming out of your ear. But unless you have employers really demanding labor, you're not going to get good manpower training. Therefore, having said all of this, since I am very pessimistic about getting the unemployment rate much below 5.5% or 5% without reigniting inflation, because I think it's very darn important for the minorities, for social problems, for people in general to do so, I am reluctantly forced to the conclusion that we've got to find a social way to impose wage controls, or in the long run, we're in trouble. So I agree fully with the impact of the problem of the question, but I just think you can't give up on pushing the unemployment rate down.
Yes, gentleman here in the middle.
My name is James Carey, Copley News Service, Washington. I'd like to ask each of the gentlemen, given the present prospects for an improving economy, what you would expect the unemployment rate to be by the time the election is held in November, and also the inflation rate.
Well, on this,
Wait a minute, Jim, wait till I get this down.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you can put the pen down. I'm not about to knowingly make news in this regard. We've said, Alan Greenspan has said, that he looks to the unemployment rate to be somewhere between 7 and 7.5% in the last quarter of this year. He has also said that we will have to look carefully at the figures.
Excuse me, Jim.
Yeah.
I know you've been on vacation for 5 days.
Yeah.
He's indicated just recently, based on the rather good February numbers, that he thinks it could go below 7 before the end of the year.
I was about to say, I hadn't read his latest clips in the last 5 days, but I do know, in talking to him personally, that he said we've had these very good figures in the first 2 months of the year, and that we would have to revise our forecast if this continues. But he wanted to see another month of the figures before he did it. I think being cautious in this area is wise. I'd rather have erred on the upside and say we've got better news than we had before. On the inflation rate, if I recall correctly, we're saying somewhere around 5.9, I think, CPI at the end of the year, if I remember. Yeah, the Consumer Price Index at the end of the year. I don't believe that he has said much about changing that one. I would have to say that particularly on that particular number, there are so many things that can influence a number of that kind. Our undue dependence on Middle Eastern oil, who knows what will happen there. I hope for the best, but you can't ever tell. I must admit that 10 years ago when I practiced law, I didn't pay much attention to what the rainfall was out in the Midwest. Today I pay a lot of attention to that, and there are things of that kind. I pay a lot of attention to the deficit, and notwithstanding conflicting views where reasonable minds may differ, I would say I'd like to see what kind of signals the Congress of the United States gives the American people and business person by way of how big that deficit is.
Charlie, you want to tackle
I wouldn't disagree with those conclusions. I would say, I'm not going to give a point estimate of either prices or unemployment. Unemployment is going to continue going down this year. As a matter of fact, I think you better be careful, because it is possible that in the next 3 months you may get some false signals, and that even though the situation is continuing to improve, it's just possible unemployment may stop its decline or even tick up a little bit in the next 3 months for technical reasons.
Let's take another question here in the middle.
My name is Arthur Carroll. Mr. Lynn got to a point before I wish he'd comment on further. For a given level of fiscal stimulus, are we to be indifferent between whether it comes from the public or the private sector?
No, I don't think we should be indifferent. I think, though, that one of the places I draw the line is to use up a given amount of stimulus, frankly, in too many cases, because it's the easy way out, by adding to expenditures. There are a number of these programs that, in my judgment, shouldn't be increased. And yet, every year, inexorably, we increase them on the expenditure side. I do think a blend is important, and I think if you look at the President's budget, there is a blend. Dr. Schultze talked about $7 billion in grant and aid reductions. Now, there are some grant and aid reductions in some areas, but I think the major part of what he's talking about is in real dollar terms, if you were going to adjust for inflation and have the same purchasing power as you had a year ago, you would have to increase the amount of money by a certain amount. But community development, I rarely hear anybody mention the fact that our budget is up some almost $500 million in community development block grants in budget authority. That outlay effect won't be felt for another year after that. The outlays, as a matter of fact, are down slightly as the old categorical programs of model cities phase out and the new programs come in. On public works, this budget is up, if I recall correctly, some 18 to 20% in current dollars, not these adjusted dollars, over last year's budget. Highways are up $700 million. But what the president is saying is, if we want to give stimulus to construction, for example, let's do it by giving a special depreciation rate to people that build new plants or new commercial shopping centers or whatever it may be in the areas of the highest unemployment in the country. I'd rather do it that way than do it through public works on the federal side.
While we're talking about that, both of these gentlemen know a particular interest I have in taxes. And I'm sorry that I didn't hear either one of you talk about the growth in what have come to be called tax expenditures. That is, the taxes that are not collected because of some preferential provision in the tax laws. And Mr. Lynn, since you were concerned about the growth in outlays, how come you never mentioned that as a problem, and in fact you just advocated a new one?
I think that it has to be looked at much the same way that you look at outlays. I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I think you noticed this year in the budget that every time we got into a section, a functional category in the budget...
That's mandated by Congress. Under the Budget Act, you have to do that.
I have to say that I think some of the details that we put in the text of the functional statements wasn't mandated by anybody. All we had to do is put in a section on tax expenditures to comply with that statute. When we showed it in juxtaposition to actual expenditures, that was our doing, because we wanted to show that it isn't just the payment of cash out by the government, it's what we lose in receipts. It can have a social purpose, it can have a business incentive purpose, whatever it may be. I think we do have to look at them much the same way as outlays. I think at the same time we have to take a harder look at off-budget kinds of items on the outlay side. Guaranteed loans, the government-sponsored agencies, and so on. And incidentally, when I hear the economists discuss the budget, there usually isn't much of a discussion as to how much stimulus is provided by some of the off-budget things that are in this budget.
Question over here.
I'd like to follow up on Mr. Lynn's comment about disagreement among economists about the fiscal stimulus of government expenditures. When I first started studying economics, it was towards the end of the Second World War. At that time, the best and the brightest of the economists forecast that because of the sharp decline in government expenditures associated with the winning of the war, that we were likely to return to the Great Depression of the 1930s with huge unemployment. It turned out that that forecast, based on a reading of the fiscal policy numbers, was greatly in error. And it turned out that when the public sector got smaller, that the private sector got larger. After that time, I became an economist, and I went through the usual things having to do with the econometrics and whatnot in order to win my brownie points. And it turns out that over the long pull, that when the public sector gets bigger, the private sector gets smaller. When the public sector gets smaller, the private sector gets larger. Over the short pull, when government expenditures go up, it's very hard, beyond 3 months, and I'm very dubious about those numbers, to know what, in fact, the so-called fiscal stimulus is. So my question to you, Mr. Schultze, is what is the basis for your arguments that somehow we need a large government budget, or at least that we ought to resist restraining the growth in the budget in order to make sure that the private sector itself doesn't get smaller?
My basic reason is because I don't agree with you. I don't think there's any warrant for looking at post-war cycles to draw the conclusion that in a cyclical upturn, when the government gets larger, the private sector gets smaller. Had that been true, we should have had the recession continuing last year and had about 15% unemployment. Strangely enough, the budget got larger, and so did the private economy. Presumably, as economists, we know that when the economy is close to full employment, what you're stating is exactly correct. That if we're up to the size of the pie, that if the government takes a larger slice, there's less left for the private sector. We all know that. What I had hoped we had learned over the last 30 years was that in periods of recession, that when you increase the governmental stimulus, and there are a lot of ways to do it. I'm not saying you have to do it through expenditures. You can do it through tax cuts. You can do it through easier monetary policy, a lot of ways. But stimulus provided by the government, let's stay away from monetary policy and just talk fiscal policy, can give you an increase both in the private and in the public sector. Now, we can argue like the devil about the magnitude, and we can argue like the devil about how far we want to push it. And we can argue like the devil about what kind of an inflationary risk we're ultimately running. But dear God, I thought we had learned, but maybe we haven't, that it is in periods of recession that you do this. Not only that, I also thought we'd learned that the converse held true, that when you're in a period of inflation, when you decrease the government sector, also healthily decrease the private sector and reduce excessive demand in the economy.
I fear we're just getting started, but we're just getting finished. I want to thank this lively audience, and in particular, I want to thank James T. Lynn, our present budget director, and Charles L. Schultze, a former budget director, for coming to grips with some real issues.
The debate you have seen brought into conflict the views of two experts in the field of federal budgeting. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, whose aim is to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints. By so doing, it is hoped that those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit by such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.